Welcome to Ace My Exams Learning. Let us get started with today's learning.
History Grade 12. The Coming of Democracy to South Africa and Coming to Terms with the Past. Question: the violence and uncertainty that South Africa experienced during the early 1990s made the road to democracy almost impossible. Explain to what extent you agree with the statement above. Support your line of argument with relevant evidence. This essay question asks learners to weigh how violence and instability threatened, yet also shaped, South Africa's transition to democracy. The best way to answer is to begin by agreeing that events such as the Boipatong and Bhisho massacres, the assassination of Hani, and the Shell House shootings created fear and mistrust that made democracy seem almost impossible. Then, show with evidence how these crises were managed through renewed negotiations, compromises like the Sunset Clause, and agreements such as the Record of Understanding, which kept the process alive. Finally, conclude by arguing that while violence nearly derailed the process, it ultimately reinforced the urgency of peace, leading to the 1994 elections and the birth of democracy. The early 1990s in South Africa were a period of turbulence, marked by massacres, political assassinations, and violent clashes between rival groups. At first glance, these events seemed to make the road to democracy almost impossible, as the nation teetered on the edge of civil war. Each outbreak of violence, whether the Boipatong massacre, the assassination of Hani, or the bloody confrontations between the ANC and IFP, created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that threatened to derail fragile negotiations. Yet, these very crises forced political leaders and ordinary South Africans to confront the reality that violence could not deliver lasting solutions. This essay emphasizes that rather than destroying the democratic process, moments of bloodshed and instability highlighted the urgent need for compromise, mutual concessions, and national unity. In this way, the turbulence of the early 1990s did not prevent the transition to democracy, but instead strengthened the determination of South Africans to overcome their divisions and secure a peaceful, inclusive future. Here is the essay. The early 1990s in South Africa were a period of turbulence, marked by massacres, political assassinations, and violent clashes between rival groups. At first glance, these events seemed to make the road to democracy almost impossible, as the nation teetered on the edge of civil war. Each outbreak of violence or bloody confrontations between the ANC and IFP created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that threatened to derail fragile negotiations. Yet, these very crises forced political leaders and ordinary South Africans to confront the reality that violence could not deliver lasting solutions. This essay emphasizes that rather than destroying the democratic process, moments of bloodshed and instability highlighted the urgent need for compromise, mutual concessions, and national unity. In this way, the turbulence of the early 1990s did not prevent the transition to democracy, but instead strengthened the determination of South Africans to overcome their divisions and secure a peaceful, inclusive future. The roots of South Africa's journey toward democracy lie in decades of entrenched apartheid, a system of racial segregation and oppression that denied the majority of South Africans basic political, social, and economic rights. By the late 1980s, apartheid faced mounting internal and external pressure. Mass mobilizations, economic sanctions, and international condemnation exposed the unsustainability of white minority rule. Against this backdrop, F.W. de Klerk ascended to the presidency in 1989, inheriting a nation on the brink of chaos. He faced the monumental challenge of dismantling apartheid while managing a volatile and often violent political landscape. On the 2nd of February, 1990, de Klerk delivered a historic speech in Parliament, announcing the unbanning of political and civic organizations such as the African National Congress, ANC, the South African Communist Party, SACP, and Azapo simultaneously, restrictions on trade unions like COSATU were lifted, signaling a willingness to engage in meaningful negotiations. This announcement was immediately followed by the release of Nelson Mandela on the 11th of February, 1990, a symbolic and practical step that legitimized dialogue and paved the way for formal negotiations. Further measures, including the repeal of key apartheid legislation, such as the Separate Reservation of Amenities Act, demonstrated a commitment to legal and structural reform. Negotiations began in earnest with initiatives like the Groot Schuur Minute in May 1990, where Mandela and de Klerk's delegations established mutual commitments to peaceful transition, and the Pretoria Minute in August 1990, in which the ANC agreed to suspend its armed struggle. These early agreements reflected both optimism and the complexities of reconciling opposing demands. The National Party sought to protect minority rights, while the ANC pressed for majority rule and a rapid path to a democratic government. In the early 1990s, as negotiations were underway, violence erupted across South Africa in regions such as the Rand and Natal, involving clashes between the Inkatha Freedom Party (IFP), the African National Congress (ANC), and covert Third Force operatives linked to security structures. These violent confrontations created an atmosphere of fear and insecurity, with communities caught in crossfire and political leaders under constant threat. Ordinary citizens lived with uncertainty, as political assassinations, arson, and street battles became almost routine. Early negotiations illustrated both the promise of a peaceful transition and the fragility of the process. The Groot Schuur Minute of May 1990, where Mandela and de Klerk's delegations committed to dialogue and reconciliation, alongside the Pretoria Minute of August 1990, in which the ANC agreed to suspend its armed struggle, reflected a tentative trust between former adversaries and a shared willingness to explore compromise. However, this fragile trust was severely tested with the collapse of CODESA II on the 2nd of May, 1992, which vividly illustrated how uncertainty and political tension threatened to make the road to democracy nearly impossible. Disputes over the composition of the constitution-making body and the interim government revealed the deep divisions between the NP, which demanded a minority veto, and the ANC, which insisted on simple majority rule. These opposing positions created the real risk of a political deadlock that could have stalled the democratic transition entirely. The intensity of the disagreement and the precariousness of the negotiations highlighted how fragile the process had become in the face of uncertainty. Only through intensive back-channel talks, mediated discussions, and the drafting of compromise frameworks, culminating in the record of understanding on the 26th of September, 1992, were the parties able to restore momentum. The Boipatong massacre on the 17th of June, 1992 represented a sudden and brutal escalation of violence that threatened to derail South Africa's fragile negotiations. The killing of 45 township residents by attackers linked to the Third Force created widespread fear, outrage, and uncertainty, highlighting how easily bloodshed could destabilize the democratic process. The massacre led the ANC to suspend its participation in negotiations, illustrating how violence could immediately halt the democratic process and make the road to democracy appear almost impossible. The uncertainty generated by the event undermined trust between the negotiating parties, as the ANC accused the National Party (NP) government of complicity, while the NP denied responsibility. Despite this, careful intervention by Mandela and de Klerk, supported by international mediators and civil society, allowed negotiations to resume. The incident forced all parties to confront the urgent need for compromise and trust building, demonstrating that while violence threatened to derail democracy, it also underscored the necessity of structured dialogue and reinforced the determination to continue the negotiation process. Similarly, the Bhisho massacre on the 7th of September, 1992, in which Ciskei security forces opened fire on protesters, killing 28 people, brought the country to the brink of a political collapse. The incident intensified tensions between the ANC and the NP, creating a real risk that negotiations would collapse completely. Public outrage and widespread strikes further heightened uncertainty, showing how violent events could destabilize the entire transition process. The massacre highlighted that compromise and mutual concessions were essential to prevent further bloodshed and ensure that negotiations could continue. In this way, both Boipatong and Bhisho, while threatening to derail democracy, ultimately propelled the parties to negotiate with renewed effort, demonstrating that even the most extreme violence reinforced the imperative to work toward a peaceful, inclusive, and democratic South Africa. In response to the growing landscape of violence and heightened tension between the negotiating parties, the Record of Understanding, signed on the 26th of September, 1992 by Rolf Meyer of the NP and Cyril Ramaphosa of the ANC, became a pivotal instrument in stabilizing South Africa's fragile democratic process. Following crises such as the Boipatong and Bhisho massacres, the environment of fear, distrust, and uncertainty had escalated to the point where negotiations risked complete collapse. The agreement established formal mechanisms to resolve disputes, improve communication, and ensure security during protests and negotiation sessions. It also provided mutual assurances to prevent further escalation of violence and addressed each party's concerns regarding interim governance. By institutionalizing these safeguards, the Record of Understanding transformed moments of instability into opportunities for compromise, reinforced trust between the parties, and allowed negotiations to continue with renewed determination toward a peaceful, inclusive democracy. The assassination of Chris Hani on the 10th of April, 1993 represented one of the most profound threats to South Africa's fragile democratic transition. Hani, as the charismatic leader of the South African Communist Party and chief strategist of the ANC's armed wing, was widely admired across racial and political lines, and his murder by a right-wing extremist sparked immediate fears of mass retaliation and nationwide unrest. Townships erupted in protests and strikes, and tensions between the ANC, IFP, and right-wing groups escalated dangerously, threatening to undo months of careful negotiation. Rather than allowing the tragedy to derail the process, Mandela's calm and authoritative appeal for restraint, combined with emergency meetings between ANC and NP leaders, created a sense of urgency that could not be ignored. The shock of Hani's death made both parties acutely aware that delaying compromise could lead to further bloodshed, pushing them to resolve outstanding disputes more swiftly. In this way, the assassination, while tragic, galvanized political leaders to negotiate with renewed determination, accelerating the drafting of the interim constitution and ensuring that the democratic transition moved forward under intense public scrutiny and pressure. Amid the growing climate of violence and the ever-present threat to the negotiations, the Multi-Party Negotiating Forum, MNF, became an essential mechanism for safeguarding South Africa's democratic transition. Established after the collapse of CODESA II and in the wake of escalating incidents such as the Boipatong and Bhisho massacres, the MNF provided a structured and inclusive platform where the ANC, NP, and smaller political parties could engage in sustained, formal dialogue. By institutionalizing the negotiation process, it reduced uncertainty and prevented disputes from spilling over into further violence, while allowing contentious issues, such as minority rights, governance structures, and electoral processes, to be addressed transparently. The MNF thus transformed a period of crisis and division into productive negotiation, reinforcing trust between parties, stabilizing the democratic process, and laying the foundation for the interim constitution and the historic 1994 elections. However, despite all the efforts to maintain the negotiating process, there were extremist factions that actively sought to undermine it, most notably the right-wing AWB attack on the World Trade Center in 1993. Armed members of the Afrikaner Weerstandsbeweging drove armored vehicles into the conference venue, firing weapons and threatening delegates, in a dramatic attempt to derail the multi-party negotiations. The attack created a climate of fear and chaos, exposing the vulnerability of the democratic process to violent obstruction and the persistent resistance of hardline right-wing groups to compromise. It also highlighted the stakes of the transition. Negotiators realized that failure to manage security and maintain dialogue could spark a wider conflict. Rapid intervention by law enforcement, the immediate securing of delegates, and the resumption of talks under reinforced security measures prevented the attack from halting progress. Rather than derailing the democratic process, the AWB attack galvanized political leaders and negotiators, reinforcing their awareness of the fragility of peace and the urgency of compromise. It served as a stark reminder that violent obstruction could not dictate the country's future, prompting parties to redouble their efforts to maintain dialogue, strengthen security measures, and commit to a negotiated settlement. The process received a glimmer of hope with the introduction of the Sunset Clause in 1993 by Joe Slovo, which provided a practical solution to the entrenched deadlock between the ANC and NP. Amidst ongoing violence, uncertainty, and mistrust, exacerbated by incidents such as the Boipatong and Bhisho massacres, the clause offered a compromise that safeguarded minority rights while allowing for a limited-duration interim government, addressing the core demands of both parties. By creating a mechanism for structured negotiation and ensuring that no side felt marginalized, the Sunset Clause enabled talks to resume with renewed momentum, transforming a period of stagnation into a tangible path forward, making it possible to continue the democratic transition and ultimately paving the way for the interim constitution and the historic 1994 elections. Despite continuous negotiation and painstaking efforts to secure a democratic future, new violence emerged, often fueled by groups unhappy with the progress achieved or the unresolved shortcomings of the process. The Shell House Massacre on the 28th of March, 1994, when the Inkatha Freedom Party, IFP, marched on the ANC headquarters resulting in 8 deaths and over 250 injuries, starkly illustrated how fragile the transition remained. Occurring just weeks before the historic elections, the massacre created intense uncertainty, threatening to derail the final stages of the democratic process. Rather than halting progress, this crisis underscored the urgent need for compromise and strengthened the determination of all parties to adhere to negotiated agreements, allowing preparations for the 27th of April, 1994 elections to continue despite the prevailing danger. The Heidelberg Tavern Massacre of the 31st of January, 1993, carried out by a faction of APLA, deepened the sense of uncertainty gripping South Africa. By deliberately targeting civilians in a public space, the attack magnified public fear and shook confidence in the negotiation process. Many began to question whether talks could deliver peace when ordinary people were being slaughtered. The risk was that communities would descend into retaliatory violence, derailing national dialogue altogether. While tragic, the event underscored the dangers of stalling negotiations and reinforced the urgency of finding a structured political solution before the violence consumed the country. The St. James Massacre of July 1993, when APLA gunmen stormed a church and killed 11 congregants while wounding 58, again pushed South Africa to the brink of collapse. The brutal attack intensified racial and political tensions, leaving many fearing that reconciliation was impossible. This incident not only endangered the fragile trust built in negotiations, but also risked provoking uncontrollable retaliatory attacks that could end dialogue entirely. The swift responses by both security forces and political leaders, combined with widespread public appeals for calm, managed to prevent the bloodshed from spiraling further. These continued massacres became a grim reminder to the negotiating parties and the nation at large that the only way to stop such atrocities was through urgent progress in negotiations, and transform the violent crisis into renewed determination to fast-track democratic agreements. Amidst this climate of uncertainty, the adoption of the interim constitution in November 1993 provided a crucial breakthrough. The violence of 1992 and 1993 had shown that without clear structures, the process could collapse into chaos. By institutionalizing compromises such as the sunset clause and mechanisms for power sharing, the interim constitution addressed many of the deadlocks that had stalled negotiations. It offered a predictable framework for elections, governance, and minority rights, thereby reducing the scope for extremist groups to exploit uncertainty. In this way, the constitution became the anchor that held South Africa steady and led it out of its most violent and unstable period. The announcement of the election date on the 27th of April, 1994, followed by the ANC's victory and Mandela's inauguration as the first black president, brought South Africa's long and painful transition to its defining moment. After years of violence, massacres, assassinations, and bitter deadlocks, millions of South Africans went to the polls in a peaceful and inclusive election. What had once seemed almost impossible, a democratic future shared by all races, was made possible through resilience, sacrifice, and unshakable determination. In conclusion, the violence and uncertainty that South Africa endured during the early 1990s made the road to democracy seem almost impossible, yet these very trials gave the process its momentum. Each massacre, assassination, and political clash exposed the fragility of negotiations, but also demanded bolder efforts, forcing leaders to confront reality with courage and urgency. Rather than destroying the democratic process, these crises compelled compromise, inspired mutual concessions, and strengthened the resolve to achieve unity, culminating in the historic 1994 elections and the birth of a peaceful, inclusive democracy.
To access more learning and exam preparation materials, go to www.acemyexams.coza. This link is also in the video description below. Thank you for watching this video. Remember to subscribe and be the first to know when we upload new videos.